Good morning. Hello, everybody. I'm Isabel Hunter. I'm the Chief Executive of Libraries Connected and really pleased to welcome you to the event this morning. We will be recording this event and putting it on our YouTube channel for people who can't attend today. And we'll also be circulating the slides. The speakers have put some really great slides together, so we can circulate those. And at the end of the meeting, we'll send out an evaluation form because we're really keen to hear what you thought of the event and any ideas on how we can make our future ones even better. And as we go along, please do make free and full use of the chat box to put in comments. And hopefully we'll have time after the speakers for some discussion so I can trawl the chat box for some of the comments and questions that you put in there. So we were really keen to hold this event to look at the spending review this year and to do it quite quickly. I know it's only a couple of weeks since we had the spending review announcements, but it feels like there's been an awful lot of interest in this spending review. I mean, it's always a really big event and there's a great deal of interest, but this time round it seemed stronger than usual. And I guess that's because it's kind of a post-Brexit spending review, but also the first, even though we're not out of the pandemic, it's kind of the first post-pandemic review and the one that will show the direction the government would like to take the country once as the pandemic subsides. So we thought it was really useful to have a look at what it means for libraries. So although it can take quite a while to untangle what the announcements in the spending review mean, it takes a while for the various government departments to work through the announcements and their settlements and to work out what that will actually mean in spending power and programs and money that could go directly into the different sectors that they support. So it will take a little time yet for Arts Council, for example, to work through what its settlement means and what that money means in terms of the grants programs and the national portfolio program that it runs. And the same for DCMS. They're still working through that in detail. But we do know that there are some direct opportunities for libraries, so things that we'll want to keep a really close eye on as they emerge. And there's been further money announced for another round of the Library Improvement Fund. And that's tremendous news because I'm sure many of you will have been involved in bids to the first round of that fund. And we all know that had an absolutely incredible response. The number of bids that went into that was really strong. So that actually was really good evidence back to government so that we've got a second round of that funding. So I'm sure that will be equally well received by libraries. There's also more funding for the British Library's business intellectual property centres, the BIPCs that the British Library develops in partnership with libraries across the country. So again, tremendous news, and it's great to see that the government continues to see the great value of these centres, especially, really important part of supporting local economies to recover and to thrive after the pandemic. But we also wanted in this webinar to look a bit more broadly and crucially to look at what the settlement means for local government. So recent research has highlighted that local government is responsible for the direct funding, the 90% of libraries' budget. So it's absolute. So the wider fate of local government finances is absolutely directly relevant to libraries and the money that they'll receive. So we'll have Ian Leet from LGA talking about that in a moment. And we also wanted to flag up how it's important to look at some of the detail within the spending review as details emerged. So there are some opportunities that aren't necessarily so immediately obvious. They don't necessarily have libraries pasted all across the front of them, but they may well be areas of work that libraries are really keen to work in. So expanded funding for some of these areas means expanded opportunities for libraries, and some of that may indeed translate into additional resourcing for libraries so that they can participate. So that means we've also got some presentations about holiday activity and food programs and the new wave of work that's going to happen around family hubs. So we'll have, I'll introduce each speaker in turn and they'll speak for a few minutes. And then hopefully if time allows, we'll have a little bit of time at the end for you all to chip in with questions and comments. We'll aim to finish a few minutes before 11 o'clock, because I know there are some of you who may want to observe the Remembrance Day silence at 11 a.m. So first up, our first speaker, I'm really pleased to welcome Ian Leet, who's the Senior Advisor for Culture, Tourism and Sport at the Local Government Association. And I'm sure many of you know Ian because he's someone who works really, really closely with us. And especially, I think, through the pandemic, Ian's been really, really important voice for us within LGA, helping raise the importance of libraries and support their recovery work throughout the pandemic. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here to talk about this. Do have some slides, which I think we're going to put up shortly. As Isabel says, there's still a lot of dust settling around the settlement, so I apologise for anyone who's a visual thinker, because we have at the moment no graphs or pictures, so it's a very text-heavy presentation, but over time we will try and spread that out a bit. So if I could have the first actual slide, please. Thank you. So the LGA always puts in a submission to the spending review, setting out what we think are the priorities and key concerns for local government. And I thought it'd be useful to sort of set that out at the start before we go into what was actually announced. You're all familiar with the way that budgets have been squeezed over the past decade, about 40% decrease in library budgets, parallel with overall council budgets. So the LGA calculated that the annual cost pressure for councils was £2.6 billion per year, just to maintain services at their current level of access and quality. So in 3 years' time, we need £7.8 billion. Now, there's been a tendency in government to talk about council tax freedoms as a way of delivering that. But actually, if you look at that, you'd have to increase council tax by 8% per each year, which is obviously not going to be attractive to local councillors. And given the way that different areas are able to raise different amounts from council tax, you raise less council tax in Bolton than you do in Westminster, for instance, and the consequences of doing so are quite different too. So that's a really challenging position to be in. The funding has to come from elsewhere if we're really able to deliver increases effectively. And I thought, interestingly, I mean, it's sometimes depressing for me to see my entire policy area put forward in this context, but we do this because these are the services that residents are passionate about and will lobby for at the ballot box and in protest. So it's really important that government understands the risks that they're putting on some of these services like museums, sports facilities, etc. If we don't get the funding. And actually, we'd have to cut the entirety of the spending on those services each year if we didn't get a spending uplift. So this was a really crucial spending review for us and for local governments as a whole. The other interesting angle with this one was departments had put all together all of their submissions, put that into Treasury, who was then going to go away, consider it. We then had a reshuffle. So the Secretaries of State, who were ultimately in charge on spending review day, were not the ones that put in the bids to Treasury. So there was a lot of debate about, are they going to be able to change them, put their personal priorities into the departmental submissions. For the most part, Treasury said absolutely no, you're not allowed a second bite and a chance to bid for more or different funding. Now, the interesting thing is that we got Michael Gove for what was the Ministry for Housing, Community and Local Government. It's now lost local government from the title, but actually, if you look at Michael Gove's track record in government, he's a fixer. He's there to deliver levelling up, and that's really powerful. One of the first things he did was actually say, no, I am tearing up much of the departmental submission to Treasury for the spending review. I'm going to go in for a much larger sum. And by and large, he's probably got it. The other interesting thing is DCMS. We've obviously got Nadine Dorries. She wasn't able to tear up the submission in quite the same way, but she has brought already a very different spin on some of the key policy areas like levelling up. So whereas that has been previously a very infrastructure building type focus, she is very keen about social mobility and social access, although she doesn't necessarily frame it in with those words. So there's going to be some interesting policy direction that shifts possibly some of the programs and funding that DCMS has secured funding for. Can I have the next slide, please? Can we get the next slide? Thanks. So what actually happened on the day? So core spending power for local authorities, that's what we can actually spend in our areas, is going to increase by an average of 3% in real terms. That's about £4.8 billion of new grant funding. That's a lot better than everyone was expecting. We thought there were potential for more cuts. So to actually get 4.8 billion for new funding is really, really positive. There's also some variance in the amount of money that DLUC, the new department for local government, can spend as well. So they've had an increase in their budget, some of which is committed, some of that which will be from the new health and social care levy that's been announced, but others, there's some flexibility around spending. So that's going to be an interesting contribution. But of course, 4.8 billion is not the same as the 7.6 billion that we were asking for. And actually, when the LGA totaled up all of the opportunities that we identified across the full range of local government services, we found that our bid to Treasury was around £22 billion. So those are the things that we could have done if we had funding. Next slide, please. So overall, it's a standstill budget for local government, better than expected, but actually it's not going to meet all of our demand pressures. So our analysis at the moment suggests that over the next couple of years, it will allow a status quo approach. So it gives much more flexibility where we were perhaps considering we might have to unstate closures or retrench. But by that third year of the spending review, there is a £1 billion gap emerging again. So it's not going to sustain us for the full spending review period. Also, importantly, those calculations don't reflect some of the costs related to COVID. Now, by and large, government has covered the costs, direct costs to councils for COVID activity. But as Isabel said, we're not fully out of the pandemic yet. There are ongoing costs that will be associated with that. And it's unclear how much of that will be recoverable. Similarly, we have changes in the landscape. So simply energy bills are going up, and that's going to be an additional cost pressure. There are current negotiations around staff pay awards and things like that. So that there are things that aren't reflected in this that may impact on that calculation, and different areas will be in different positions about that. As I mentioned, different areas can raise different amounts through council tax and be politically willing to do that. So it's variable. Lastly, the other key point, I think, is there's been a lot of talk about social care, which is the biggest financial pressure on councils, and certainly some perceptions that it's been fixed by the government's introduction of the health and care levy. It's really a much more complex picture because there's also additional responsibilities that councils take on as part of that. A lot of that money in the first few years is ring fenced for the NHS. There's a question of when does it come over to social care? Will it come over to social care? And that could potentially really squeeze budgets for some areas. And similarly, all of that interpretation of local government's core spending power increasing is dependent on every council increasing the council tax by the full 3% that they're allowed to. So that's the sort of assumption, but local areas will vary. Next slide, please. So local government got 4.8 billion, but also there are opportunities within departments as they get their own funding. And they saw a real terms increase of 3.8%, which for DCMS equates to about £600 million. They're still working out what that money can go on. And there's a lot of discussion internally with DCS at the moment, which is why Sheila and her team aren't here today, because it's not settled. But those of you who know Sheila Bennett, she's very forceful. So if she can get anything, I'm sure she will. The other interesting thing that came out alongside the spending review is around the government's flagship levelling up policy, which has been a bit nebulous to date, but they have committed to a levelling up white paper, which I think will be really crucial for areas to understand what are they trying to achieve through this policy, how can we link up, and articulating that within your authority as to what the contribution of libraries will be. I think there are significant contributions libraries can make, but it's got to be thought through and presented to people, because I don't think it will naturally necessarily be considered. Alongside that white paper, they've announced the first allocations of the £1.7 billion levelling up fund. Really interesting to read through some of those projects. Quite a number of culture regeneration type projects. Culture is actually one of the 3 objectives for the fund. Interestingly, councils put in fewer cultural bids, so they've weighted the fund or this current decision around bids towards culture. So there's a real opportunity coming forward for the next round of that funding to get libraries and culture within that. Next slide, please. Alongside that and complementing that, we've got the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is designed to replace the European social funding that we got back from the European Union to invest in things like skills and really supporting people to develop. So there's been some pilots around that, community renewal funds, which again was announced on the day of the spending review. Some interesting projects, more on the cultural side as expected, less I think around libraries, but it's still worth looking at what your area is doing. Not if your area was able to put that in. The new next fund, which will be the UK Shared Prosperity Fund in proper, is going to look a bit different. But it's really worth looking at what got funded at the moment and then thinking how can libraries connect to that. Also, as part of UK SPF, slightly diverging from the localist intent of it, but there is a new UK-wide adult numeracy programme called Multiply, which again is really part of how the government sees they're going to give people the right skills to seek new employment, move towards that higher skilled, higher paid economy that they're looking for, and particularly targeting the North East, West Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber. So in the same way that libraries have seized on the digital agenda and digital literacy, I think there's an opportunity there to think, can we do something around numeracy as well? Next slide, please. I'm going quite rapidly through these because at the moment, literally all the detail we have is in this document. So by all means, go to it and look for more detail, but we'll keep people posted through bulletins and Libraries Connected as we get more detail on what this actually looks like when funding rounds are being announced, the criteria, that kind of stuff. Skills is an area the government's focusing on, building on that Multiply programme. There's going to be funding for level 3 courses and scale up skills boot camps. Again, an opportunity potentially for libraries to engage there. We know that higher education colleges and educational establishments are struggling a bit with space. So is there a connection that can be made there with your local providers, making use of the spaces within libraries to deliver some of that, or as supportive follow-on learning outside of the programme? Similarly, the youth offer, which is particularly looking at young job seekers, getting the skills, building confidence and lasting work. An opportunity there, not much detail, but the plan for jobs does give you an idea of where they're going with that and where you might spot an opportunity. Next slide, please. Net zero and climate change, obviously a big topic right now with COP26. Less information than you expect on this, but I think there is an opportunity coming. So it is worth looking at net zero strategy and thinking, are there connections with our local climate change strategy? Have we declared a climate emergency locally? If you have, then it's probably up higher up the agenda than if you haven't, but I know that many areas are still considering that even where they haven't declared an emergency, and particularly that's around energy emissions. So the decarbonisation fund for the public sector has just closed, but I suspect there will be more funding coming out to make buildings carbon neutral. So if you have one of the really impressive but really hard to heat buildings, as well as the specific library funding for capital investment, do consider, are there connections you can make with the corporate bids around decarbonisation? On leisure centres, we found that they can contribute up to 40% of a council's carbon emissions. I'm sure libraries aren't at that point, but can you articulate what your contribution is? Because then you'll be linking to council objectives on that. Similarly, there's the role around climate communication and behaviour change, which libraries are probably well positioned to do. So what are you doing around that? And is there an opportunity to connect to what I expect will be a series of small funds made available through both arm's length bodies as well as government directly? So it's an area I suspect there will be continuing investment on and opportunities to connect to. And the first one of those that came out as part of the spending review is a £9 million Levelling Up Parks Fund. not pocket parks as was initially announced. It is broader than that. But if you do have outside space, you're in an area where there isn't a lot of green space available, then there is funding available to make greater use of that space, bring more people into connection with nature, give them access to spaces to exercise and things like that. So a possible opportunity around that. Next slide, please. There was a surprising amount on culture. It was really positive spending review from a cultural perspective. Much of it is the broader cultural sector, but we know that libraries are key cultural infrastructure. They're always perceived as such, so it's important to actually articulate the role that you play in terms of acting as a base for freelancers, for exposing young people in particular to creative opportunities, the events that you run, the coding clubs, those kinds of things. There's a definite opportunity to connect there, both through explicit government funding, but also activities of people like the Creative Industries Federation, the Craft Council, who've just done another piece of work. I think there's a real opportunity to enhance your role there and articulate what you can do. So £42 million to support creative industries. It's definitely a government objective. I think particularly there of interest supporting SMEs to scale up and provide support for film and video games. So BIPC is absolutely in that space, and the evolution of thinking of how the hub and spoke model can work for them. And again, coding clubs and things that you do around digital literacy awareness feeds into that. Moving on more generally, very specific, but the City of Culture programme, doesn't matter if your council didn't successfully win the bid or get on the shortlist, actually just bidding for that really takes places on a journey. So it's really important that libraries are considered as part of that activity. And similarly, the what was the Festival of Britain, now something unboxed. There's obviously a reading challenge contribution as part of that, which libraries will be contributing to. We're really pushing that actually the organisations engage with councils on that, and particularly promoting the role that libraries can do in making sure that every community can participate in this and spreading that out. So those are things. Next year is basically a year of celebration planned for next year. So lots of opportunities to think how your events can reach people and promote inclusivity for these national events. Next slide, please. Some more detail, some of which is the funds that Isabel mentioned at the start, the LIF, but also a slightly nebulous £52 million for museums and cultural bodies to support recovery from COVID-19. Not sure what that looks like, or the 49 million to Thrive, but potentially opportunities there. More commitments to the creative industries and SMEs, so that really is something they're looking at. And last one, more around museums, where they've given them operational and financial freedoms, so carry on of budgets, more freedom around digital activity. But there's certainly an interest in, can we free up libraries to make more use of social media channels and things like that? Because we know that some councils are conservative. So it might be an internal debate that we can strengthen by referencing that, making use of it. Next slide, please. So those, I think, are the sort of key agendas and areas that look promising. Now, SR is really top level, so you see what's written in there, but actually there's a whole load of thinking that now goes on, now that departments know they've got this funding, and they put a lot more meat on the bone. So we'll be working to actually make sure that councils are able to access that, and there may well be bits of funding that come out either through the departmental increased spend or through a slight reprioritisation as the new Secretary of State actually get the chance to put their stamp on the policy direction. So we'll be looking very closely at that. So this is top level stuff. It's worth reading through some of those points just to see where you can go, see where your local authority is based within that, because some will be more connected into that through priority places for levelling up and things than others. So you need to understand where you are in that ranking order, really. Overall, local government finance is better than we were expecting, but it's not fixed. And the major reform programmes, so return of business rates to areas, that's been shelved. However, Michael Gove appeared before the, whatever the CLG committee is called now, yesterday, and set out some interesting thinking around that. So he is looking at a new direction for local government finance that spreads funding more equally across areas in line with levelling up. There's more flexibility in maintaining services at current levels if council tax is maximised. I have to say that's not guaranteed in every area. So understanding where your council is likely to go on that is probably going to be useful when you're framing your budget submissions over the next couple of months. Limited capacity to deliver new stuff. What is going to be new is probably through bidding programs, so making sure you're connected into those funds as they open. And there's real challenges that are unknown around rising demand for social care and also the energy costs, which again will impact on different areas differently depending when you have a nice shiny new building or a really old energy inefficient building. And last slide is for you to look at really. That's just links to the LGA submission, the on-the-day briefing, and the two Levelling Up Fund and Community Renewal Fund bids, because it's really interesting just looking at what areas are proposed for that and give you a sense of what is likely to get funded by government, but also where your leadership might be in terms of their thinking as well. So hope that's useful. Happy to take questions, and either in this event or follow up separately as well. And we'll be working very closely with Isabel and Libraries Connected to make sure that you get the latest information as it develops. I've timed that perfectly, so it's just as Isabel steps away.
Thank you, Ian. I'll just step in for Isabel in that case.
Sorry, I'm back. I'm so sorry. I've had a new fridge being fitted, and the engineer had just finished at that moment. I'm so sorry. But Ian, thank you. That was an absolute tour de force, so useful. And just to confirm, we will be circulating Ian's slides, because I know for one I need to read those several times and make some notes. But that's absolutely brilliant. You've really given a sense of the context, but also some things that we all need to look at. And I know that we at Libraries Connected will keep working really closely with you, Ian, as more of the news comes out, so we can make sure we get that info out to libraries so they can know where to look and how they need to work to potentially pull down some of that funding or get involved in that. Yeah, absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you. And so now on to our second speaker, who I know is going to be equally fantastic, and that's James Hempsall, who is the director of Hempsalls and is also a man who wears many hats, including really, really important work on the holiday activity and food programmes. So James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And whilst I'm waiting for Robert to upload my slides, I'll introduce myself. I do lead the teams at Hempsalls and at Childcare Works, and we work on early years and childcare policy implementation in the main, which means that this year we've been supporting the Department for Education on the first national rollout of the holiday activities and food programme that I'll describe as the HAF programme from this point forward. And our role as a contractor to the department is to support every local authority HAF coordinator across England to deliver and develop the holiday activities and food programme. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of how we've come to get a HAF programme, what's happened in 2021, the expected outcomes of HAF, but also the news that we've heard from the comprehensive spending review for the next 3 years. And I've set out some suggested actions if you're interested in connecting with, supporting or delivering part of the HAF programme in your local areas. And I'll finish off with a few useful links. So if we go on to the next slide, that's all about the gradual growth of HAF. You will probably be very aware that there's been much interest in holiday hunger, food poverty, socialisation, isolation, attainment gaps between disadvantaged and their peers, also known as summer learning loss, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has made some of these issues further pressure points, especially as families will have different or reduced incomes and experience increased costs of food and activities and childcare generally, but particularly in the school holidays. So this commitment was part of the government's £1 billion manifesto commitment for flexible childcare. So it goes some way to providing enriching activities for children across the school holidays. But obviously there was lots of social, political, and it has to be said, celebrity interest in the issues around food poverty and family life. So with a lack of evidence and research in these areas, the department launched what was a £2 million pilot programme in 2018, so 3 years ago. And that offered some small provision in a small number of local authorities, amounting to 283 clubs, reaching just over 18,000 children. And the programme returned in 2019 and even in 2020, even though we had the COVID-19 pandemic at its peak, and grew progressively larger. So it was about £9 million per year spent from central government, again in pilot areas, so not all local authority areas. And it's really highlighting local service providers to think about how we can better and fully consider the needs and realities of family life when they're eligible for free school meals. And this programme is targeted at children eligible for free school meals and in receipt of it. So that's important that we think about that cohort of children and the experiences that they may have in term time, but especially in school holidays. So the 2021 programme is outlined in the next slide, and I was delighted to see that we've moved from a pilot process in a few selected local authorities who'd won their bids to a programme amounting to £220 million delivered in all 151 English local authority areas. Again, aiming to offer that valuable support to families on lower incomes through holiday activities with healthy food and nutritional learning attached. So the funding requires local authorities to make sure that there are free holiday clubs available for school-aged children in receipt of benefits-related free school meals. So and when we talk about school-aged children here, we're talking children as young as 4, if they're in reception, until the end of secondary school. So it's quite a broad range of children. There is a small amount of flexibility to open up places beyond that targeted cohort. So there's 15% flexibility with the agreement of the department if a local authority wants to open up places for children just outside of that cohort or a particular targeted local need. And the activities are very broad ranging. They can include provision across outdoor and indoor sport, physical activities, arts and crafts, games and play, food learning and cooking, and trips, libraries, etc., etc. So anything that will actively engage children in those school holiday periods. And the delivery expectation was that children and young people should have access to those opportunities for across 6 weeks of the year. So it was at least a week at Easter, at least 4 weeks in summer, and a week at Christmas. So we are expecting a provision to be being delivered across December this year. Now in half terms, a day is 4 hours and a week is 4 days. So local areas delivered 4 hours a day for 4 days a week for 4 weeks across the summer as a core offer. But the next slide sets out the expectations in terms of outcomes. We want children and young people and their families to engage in HAF and as a result to consider eating more healthily, understand food in new and different ways, but also to be active in the school holidays, so that they can take part in engaging and enriching activities to support perhaps their resilience, their character and well-being, as well as linking that to their wider educational attainment, reducing attainment gaps and the like, so that they're safe and not socially isolated. And children and young people this summer have talked about how their summer reality was that they would not do anything. They would perhaps not leave the house very often, that they wouldn't return to school in September with amazing stories about what they'd been doing over the summer, or perhaps they'd been stuck in, socially isolated, in front of a screen if they have one, and not growing enriching experiences and activities instead. So it's really important that children not only have an extension of their food relationship with food, but they also have a greater knowledge of how they can eat healthily and cook and even grow food to support those sorts of positive behaviours. And we want to engage them better with school and with wider local services, including libraries, because it can be a huge agent of change. It's a new way for children, young people and families to engage with services and to break cycles within those new relationships, those isolation cycles. So the comprehensive spending review, next slide, just one slide from me on the outcomes of the comprehensive spending review. On page 68 of the report, and the link to the report there, is the amazing news for HAF that whilst we've had £220 million in 2021, for the next 3 years, each year, there will be £200 million, slightly over, funding the Holiday Activity and Food Programme. So the Holiday Activity and Food Programme, the HAF programme, will continue for the next 3 years, broadly on the same level of funding that we've experienced so far, and is part of the early years and childcare offer. It turned out that actually the comprehensive spending review gave about £1.5 billion to early years and childcare. If you include this 600 million for HAF, we have more funding for early years and childcare entitlement places, and we have a raft of other early years and health style projects, which Liz will talk about, one of those being family hubs later. So next slide is my list of 7 things that you may choose to do to connect with HAF if you've not already connected with it. Certainly, our appeal is that you support the information sharing about HAF so that your users know about it, and that you can promote provision locally and be a useful part of that non-stigmatizing messaging. Targeted programs often experience stigma, but how can we message about HAF benefits and its impact so that we increase the awareness of families who are eligible for it, and they not only book their places onto the programme, but they take up and use their places too. There's a great role for us all in supporting the reach and engagement and connecting families to that provision, including children with SEND, and helping them to book and actually take up places. I was hearing from a local authority yesterday who trained local library staff to support families who maybe don't have access to IT very readily to book their places via the local websites and the apps. So facilitating that and take up, vitally important. But of course, libraries can deliver HAF directly. You can deliver holiday activities and food programs directly, or connect with existing local providers, tour them, contribute to do some outreach and contribute to the local provision, or support other providers in other ways. So I've talked about generally consistent funding level, but we also have we need to make some assumptions that reach and demand will grow as well as awareness and engagement with this programme increases. Children and young people will come back, also within a context that the number of children eligible for free school meals has increased, and we're encouraging an impact of this programme and others to make sure that we turn eligibility for free school meals into actual take-up. And then finally, my final ask is that we all play our part in signposting and referral to wider services so that children and young people can access wider offers and meet their additional needs. And my final slide is some useful links for you. There's guidance for HAF. There's more about HAF. There's a great film to look at as well. There's the funding information for this year, and you can join our Knowledge Hub to share information and download useful resources as well. Of course, there's more information to be, as Ian said, more information to come out of the comprehensive spending review, and we await that with great interest. But it's positive news for HAF. Thank you, Isabel.
Great, thank you, James. Again, another fantastic presentation, chock full of really, really useful insight and information. And those links are especially useful. So again, we'll make sure we circulate those. We'll also circulate a link to a webinar we held a few weeks ago now about running holiday activity and food programs, where we had some insight from some libraries involved. I think that will be of really a lot of interest in this context. So thanks ever so much. And now on to our third speaker, who's Liz Hodgman, who's also another person working at LGA. And Liz is the program manager for early years at LGA. And Liz is going to talk to us about some of the exciting news surrounding family hubs. So Jane, Liz, over to you.
Thank you. Just wait for my first slide. We just move straight on to the second one, thank you. So Will Quince has been making lots of statements recently around family hubs, and that's just a statement he came out with the other day to just give you an overview. They will be buildings and virtual, so online services, mixture of the two. They'll be offering universal and targeted support, and they will take on the Great Start for Life offer for parents, care and babies at its core. Thank you. Next slide. So family hubs are a system-wide model of providing high quality family support. As I said before, they are for 0 to 19, but they go up to 25 for children with special educational needs and disabilities. They're to make a positive difference to parents, carers and their children. And they will be a universal front door for families, offering a one-stop shop for social care, education, mental health and physical health needs. So lots and lots of partners coming together to deliver this. They're an extension of the existing children's centre provision, Sure Start, but that was 0 to 5. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the spending review, around 500 million was announced for children and families in the budget. 12 million had been announced just before the budget for a transformation fund, which would support at least 12 local authorities in England to open family hubs. The money, about £1 million for each local authority, was not for new buildings. There's a tiny little bit in that money for capital to make sort of accessibility changes to buildings, but the money is to manage the change process and move the local authority and partners on. But in the spending review, another 82 million was announced that will give 75 local authorities money to set up new family hubs. There was an additional 50 million for parenting programmes, 10 million for communicating clear information about the Start for Life offer, so that's the 0 to 2 offer, the Andrea Leadsom 1001 Days review. And that we think is going to be an online platform that each local authority will have to share what is happening in their area. There's 50 million towards specialist breastfeeding support services, 100 million for bespoke mental health support for new and expectant parents, 10 million for workforce pilots in some number of local authorities, and that's around health visiting training. And then 200 million towards the expansion of Supporting Families programme. This was the previous Troubled Families programme. Thank you. Next slide. So I worked with Sarah to look at what services libraries are already offering, and obviously these will vary across the libraries that fit with the Family Hub's agenda. So there's lots of learning for support for children's learning development. So you're delivering a whole range of services from early years rhyme time to activities for older children. There's a summer reading challenges, digital engagement, homework clubs, and there's a real focus on reading for pleasure and language development. But some of your sessions will support other areas of development for children. For example, craft activities with children using scissors will be physical development. There's lots of support for parenting, so there's resources they can learn, parenting guides and manuals, basic skills support, advice for setting up small businesses, and crucially an opportunity to meet other parents. For some parents, parenting can be very isolating. They're away from work, and their family and friends, and it can be quite an isolating time. Thank you. Also supporting families living in poverty. James has already gone through the HAF offer, free access to Wi-Fi, IT support so they can access welfare benefits. Many parents who are living in poverty struggle to fill out online application forms using mobile phones with no data, housing applications, all sorts of things. There's support for health and well-being, so social prescribing schemes, your Reading Well collections for adults and children, your health visitor clinics and baby weighing. We know that happens in some libraries across the country. Some are breastfeeding friendly, and some you have wellbeing champions. We also know that there's support for special needs, and you've got resources and signposting, visual impairment support, and some libraries are autism friendly. Thank you. So with all the new funding and the real push for all local authorities to have a family hub, what are the opportunities for libraries? So I've put together a few ideas, but I'll explain later how we want to explore these further. So there's the opportunity to deliver family services within libraries. You've already got this happening in some, so this could be extended with baby weighing and clinics with health visitors coming in. But there's an opportunity for the hub to deliver more within libraries and maybe hold surgeries on different topics depending on the needs that the librarians have identified from their families. So for example, during a rhyme time session, the librarian may have identified that there's some families where they've got concerns around their children's speech and language development. So they could work with the hub to actually have a speech and language session, or a therapist come to one of the sessions, so the families don't feel they've been signposted, but they're supported on site. Delivery of library sessions within the main hub. So it could be that the children's librarian regularly visits the family hub and meets the families there and encourages them to sign up to the library, deliver story sessions. You could even run the summer reading challenge within the family hub so that families can access it there. There could be an increase in the breastfeeding friendly offer. So a librarian could pick up that there's quite a few mums that are coming with their older children to rhyme time, but they've got new babies and maybe they're struggling with breastfeeding. So they could contact the hub and ask for the breastfeeding coordinator to maybe pop in and meet with them. And there could be hub prescribing of library services. That could be part of targeted intervention work where families are signposted and prescribed library services. And then moving on to the next slide. It's important, I think, that the offer that the library has for families is included in the published offer that the family hub will do. So that could be online, but also in any documentation. So we need to make sure it's included. We understand there's going to be branding, but we're not sure whether this will be national branding, as in Sure Start was, or local branding for the family hub. But I think it's really important that any library services are part of that branded offer, so families can recognise the logo and know that it's a service for them and it's suitable for them. And also making sure that library events, that are family events, are shared on the family hub calendar, so they're promoted. So that could be your regular rhyme time slots, but also if you had an author coming to share some session with children or young people, that could be shared in the events calendar. I think it's important that the head of service for libraries or the leader of libraries is involved in the governance and leadership of the local family hub. So this could be part of the leadership team or the board or however the governance is set up. I think it's really key that they have a voice in that. I think it's also important to have access to the general workforce and training and development that's going to come out of the family hubs. Libraries will see families that no one else sees for a period of time. I'm thinking mainly of the period where children are probably aged 2 to 3 or 1 to 3. They're not accessing 2-year-old funding. They will see their health visitor for a developmental check, but may then not be in contact with any other professional. So the only people that might be seeing that family and that child on a regular basis will be the librarians at the rhyme time sessions. So I think it's really important they have a really good understanding of the issues that families face, where to signpost for help, and how to identify them. So I think it's really important that they get access to workforce training. I also feel that shared planning So they're part of that planning process of activities that will stop duplication of services and make everyone more informed. Information sharing and data sharing is going to be key for this. Thank you. Next slide. So I'm really keen that libraries are part of the Family Hub offer. So what we'd like to do, we've got some bespoke money to use from the DFE, and we'd like to work with 4 areas with their libraries and their local authority and partners to do a mini review or a little deep dive into that area. We want to look at what is happening with the library services in connection with early years, Family Hub offer, identify where there's strengths, areas for consideration, and make recommendations on how things could be moved forward. So we're looking for 4 different areas because we understand that things are quite different in different areas, so rural and city and mixed areas. So we will be producing some criteria. At the end of it, we hope to produce a paper and possibly a toolkit to support libraries working within the Family Hub's offer, so they can have more access to some of the funding that's available. So we're producing at the moment an expression of interest form and an overview of how this will work and the criteria, and this will come out through Libraries Connected via email, and then we hope to be able to start that work in January next year, and that work will run for 3 months. So at the end of March we'll be able to produce some information on that. Thank you. Next slide. So before I leave, there's some useful resources of information. The National Centre for Family Hubs, which is run by the Anna Freud Centre on behalf of the government. They've got a big website now with their toolkit that was published last week. Also last week, the government published the Family Hub Model Framework, which gives some really good information set out quite clearly around how family hubs. I'm sure that will change and evolve as family hubs do. And then the last slide just provide links to those documents that you might find useful. Thank you.
Wow, another absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you. And yeah, it's great to be able to share with everyone how we're working really closely with LGA on this one. And I think some of the things you stressed really strongly there, Liz, how libraries get in the picture, how they make sure that they're part of planning and processes, and that it's that connecting thing again, isn't it, that we need to do. So it's really, really great to be working with you, and I know that you and Sarah Mears are working really closely on this. So yeah, really exciting piece of work, and we're very grateful to have your help to push libraries into the forefront of this. We are nearly out of time, but I know there are a couple of questions in the chat. What we'll do is we'll scoop up those questions and see if we can get some written answers back to you. But I don't know if we've got time for, there's one question actually, Ian, that you might be able to answer that's come from Martin Burton. And he's asked, as an authority that's relatively affluent, will it be harder to access funding, which will be directed at the more, will funding be directed at the more deprived authorities? I don't know if you've got any feeling on that yet.
It's going to depend on the specific funding stream, but I wouldn't rule yourself out automatically. Levelling Up in particular had criteria that wasn't purely focused on deprivation. So you may well have been identified as a priority place. It's worth looking at that list. Arts Council has a similarly different list of priority places, which is based more on opportunities around engagement. So it's worth looking at all of these different funds to see if you qualify. But every area will have access to some funding.
Great, thank you, thank you. So it's really looking as widely as possible and being fleet of foot, isn't it, as usual. There's another question that I think we've just got time for, and that's from Sue Ball. And this question's directed at Liz, and Sue's asking, libraries have been part of the early years peer reviews. Will the early years peer reviews continue, and will libraries continue to be part of that process?
Yeah, they were put on hold when we first went into lockdown because it was impossible for us to get out into the local authorities, and the local authorities and the health services were so busy responding to COVID that it would have been inappropriate for us to go out. We are hoping that they will continue. Like everyone else, we're waiting to see what funding we get from the spending review in terms of what the DfE commissioners to do from March going onwards, but we are hoping, and yes, they will be very much, libraries will be very much involved. I really pushed for them to be involved at the very beginning because I really felt they're a real core part of the review.
Well, that's brilliant. Yeah, and I think it proved really good for libraries who were involved as peer reviewers. It was a really good learning opportunity for them, and of course another great opportunity to get the library message across too. That's great news. And Ian's just posted in the comments there that LJ has 10 free culture and library peer challenges on offer at the moment, and that there's the link there. So we'll send that out to everyone as well, because they're always, people who've been through the peer reviews are always really, really positive about them. So that is definitely something to look at. So unfortunately, we need to draw to a close this morning, but that really, really has been fantastic. There's so much to take in. And as I said, I know that I'll be going over the slides and digesting and redigesting. But I just want to give a quick round of applause to our 3 fantastic speakers, Ian, James and Liz. And thank you so much for pulling together such informative presentations at really short notice. I feel this has really helped my thinking, and I'm sure everyone, I can see the comments coming through, really useful, super useful, really informative. So yeah, very, very much appreciated by everyone listening in today, and hopefully we'll have even more people on the recordings. So thank you very much.